Okay, there we go. I wanted to talk today about, as we prepare for Purim, which is less than 2 weeks away, which means that Passover is less than 6 weeks away, a focus of a lot of our sessions now are going to be on those two holidays. So I wanted to talk today about the Book of Esther itself, and next week we'll talk about the holiday of Purim and everything associated with Purim. But the Book of Esther, I think, warrants a little bit of exploration, and I wanted to talk about it mainly in context of other books of the Bible, and what we think about when we think about a book from the Bible, and then how does the Book of Esther fit in with that general idea that we have of the Bible. So it's good to see everybody today. Happy President's Day to everybody. And again, if you have a question or a comment, feel free to unmute yourself and interject at any point, or go to the chat and type a question or a comment there, and I'll be sure to see it. So when we think of books of the Bible, and I'm talking about the Jewish Bible, of course, not the Christian Bible. When we think about books of the Bible, we think about the Torah, especially, as being a book of law, commandments, ethical, moral principles, stories of the Jewish people. So, for example, and here, let me share my screen and show you. So a great website, by the way, for books, for to access most Jewish texts for free, kind of makes a Jewish library an actual library of the actual physical books, like you see behind me, which is actually just a picture because I'm in my house upstairs, in my office upstairs with a virtual background. It makes books obsolete when we have a website like Sefaria. Sefaria is a great free website. Every now and then, when you go to the website, something will pop up on the screen, make a donation. But that's what these free websites do. But it's a great resource for Jewish study. So it has prayer book on it. It has the entire Bible on it in Hebrew and in English. It has commentary on the Bible, mostly in Hebrew, some of it in English translation. So it's really, really a great resource. That's my plug for Sefaria. And I have it as one of my bookmarks in my favorites. So when we think of the Torah, for example, here is Exodus chapter 20, and this is the 10 Commandments. God spoke all these words, saying, I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. So an example of one major element of, just a second. Yes, and Arnie is just pointing out that, yes, all these apps are available on your phone as well. However you access your internet, you can access Sefaria. So so when you think of Torah, you think of the 10 Commandments. You could also think about the story of the creation of the world, Noah's Ark. So there are magical kind of stories, miracle stories, the 10 plagues, not just the 10 Commandments. So that's one aspect that we think of with the Bible. We could also think of from the prophets, like Isaiah chapter 6. Which is Isaiah's vision here. In the year that King Uzziah died, I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the skirts of God's robe filled the temple. Seraphs, these burning angelic creatures, stood in attendance on God. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2, he covered his face. With 2, he covered his legs. And with 2, he would fly. And one would call to the other, "Holy, holy, holy, the Lord of hosts. God's presence fills all the earth." So there is this kind of passage that is common to the Bible also. Not just Isaiah, but other prophets have this vision of being called to prophecy, and also what they see when they see God's presence. So here, this phrase, Kadosh, 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 which we say if there's a minyan twice a day, morning and afternoon in the service. On Shabbat, we say it in the Musaf service as well. In the Kedusha, we say it in the morning service also before the Shema. So it's a phrase that we are familiar with that has become incorporated from the Bible into the prayer book. So when we picture Bible, we picture the prophets relaying to the people what they see when they see God. So there's this vision of God's heavenly court and these flaming creatures that are there in God's presence. Or it could be Ezekiel's vision of the chariot that is with these bizarre creatures all around the chariot that are below God's throne, and in between God's throne and the chariot is this layer of sapphire. We had that in this past Shabbat's Torah reading. In the portion Mishpatim, we have a vision of God's throne and the sapphire as well. So we have so when we picture Bible, when we think of the Bible, we think of this kind of mystical kind of idea of what God's heavenly realm is like. We also perhaps think of, for example, the book of Jonah, where the one purpose of a prophet is to try to get the people to repent. So the very beginning of the 4-chapter book of Jonah, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, "Go at once to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim judgment upon it, for their wickedness has come before me." So either get them to repent, or let them know that if they don't repent, that judgment, that punishment is coming. So many of the prophets talk about the impending doom unless people repent, or even if they do repent, that still the people are beyond saving and they need to be punished. So there's a sense of reward and punishment, or impending doom, that we find in the Bible too. So we have law, we have story of the Jewish people, we have exhortation to improve behavior, we have talk of impending doom, we have a description of what God's heavenly realm is like, and there's more. When we sometimes also, when we think of the Bible, we might think about statements that are about what life is all about. What is the meaning of life? So the book of Ecclesiastes is one example of this, along with the book of Proverbs. The words of Kohelet, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Utter futility, said Kohelet, utter futility, all is futile. What real value is there for a man in all the gains he makes beneath the sun, right? So this 12-chapter book is about what we're supposed to do with our life. Is it all about enjoying everything in the moment? Are we supposed to, how are we supposed to find meaning in life? So like I said, the book of Ecclesiastes is like that. Job has that a little bit. The book of Proverbs especially has this. And when we think of the Bible, we also think of the 150-chapter book of Psalms. So this perhaps being the most famous of all the Psalms, a Psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me to water and places of repose. Though I walk through a valley of the shadow of death, is usually how it's translated, right? So we have a psalm like this, that of many psalms like this, that respond to our emotions, whether we are in deepest despair, like Psalm 23, or the very next psalm, the earth is the Lord's and all that it holds, the world and its inhabitants. He founded it upon the ocean, set it on the nether streams. It's a great psalm describing how wonderful the earth is and how wonderful God's universe is, and that we should all be able then to be in God's presence. So the book of Psalms is another thing we think of when we think of the Bible, thinking about how personally, individually, we can respond to our emotions and connect to God in that way. So these are just some of the many ways that we can talk about the Bible when we think about the Jewish Bible. And then there's the Book of Esther, which does not fit in any way to anything that I have just shared with you. All that it might connect to is perhaps a story of the Jewish people, because everything else about the Bible certainly has God in it. If you were to come up with the common denominator that would be across any kind of book of the Bible, you would say that to be a book in the Bible, you'd have to have God in the book. To be a book of the Bible, it has to be about the Jewish people. To be a book in the Bible, it has to teach some kind of Jewish lesson, some moral or ethical religious lesson. So if it has all those, then it should be in the Bible. So the Book of Esther, the number one thing I said, the first definition I said, has to have God's name in it. The Book of Esther does not have God's name in the book at all. And though it talks about Jews, that is Mordecai and Esther and the Jews of Shushan, it's a story that purports to be historical, but there is no historical evidence whatsoever that this story ever took place or that it could have taken place. Now, so let me stop there for a moment and break that statement apart. So we first have to understand how books make it into the Bible, right? So how is it that the Jewish Bible, as we know it, came into being? Okay, so we might imagine that the Bible, as we know it, has been around for thousands of years. That's not the case. The Mishnah, which I've talked about before, and I will continue to talk about as we journey through the Jewish year, because Judaism, as we know it today, is based on the rabbis. The first collection of rabbinic law and interpretation of the Torah is the Mishnah, edited 1800 years ago. In the Mishnah, the rabbis discuss what books make it into the Bible and what books are not in the Bible. And they discuss at length about the book of Song of Songs, which I didn't mention, which I'll get to later on in our journey, perhaps when we talk about Passover. The Song of Songs, which essentially is a love story. And some might question why the Song of Songs is in there, but nobody questions the Book of Esther. Book of Esther is in the book. There's some question the book of Ecclesiastes, some question the book Song of Songs, but there isn't a question about the Book of Esther. In fact, there's a lot of midrash about the Book of Esther, and that even that the holiday of Purim will be one holiday that we'll continue to celebrate in the time of the Messiah. So we'll talk about that a little bit more next week when we talk about the holiday of Purim. So the Book of Esther, there's no argument that it should be in the Bible. And secondly, the rabbis themselves determined which books make it into the Bible and which books do not make it into the Bible. So I just wanted to just take a moment here to explain this idea. So the Jewish Bible, as we know it, consists of three sections: the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, then the section known as the prophets, which have history books and also the books of prophets. So it has Joshua, Judges, the 2 books of Samuel, and the 2 books of Kings. And then the 3 major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and 12 minor prophets, including Jonah and Amos and Obadiah, prophets like those. And then the section called writings. So it's Torah, prophets in Hebrew, Nevi'im, and then the writings, which in Hebrew is Ketuvim. Take the first letter of those 3 words, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Bibles in Hebrew is referred to as Tanakh. So the 3 letters there is an abbreviation pronounced Tanakh. And so when you say Bible in Hebrew, you're saying Tanakh. That's the Jewish Bible again. So the books of writings are Psalms, Job, Ecclesiastes, the scrolls, Esther, Lamentations, and then you have some history books at the end, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the 2 books of Chronicles and Daniel. And so the timeline of the Bible itself it extends from the creation of earth and humanity until about the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, which is around 500 BCE, give or take. So you're talking about up to 500 BCE, okay? There are other books that we know of that were written before the time of the rabbis. In Hebrew, one would be Ben Sira. He is also referred to as Ecclesiasticus. There are phrases and verses from Ben Sira that are known to us that are in the prayer book and that are used the rabbis referred to Ben Sira, but Ben Sira did not make it into the Bible. There are books that are important books that did not make it into the Bible that are in another collection called the outside books. In Hebrew, Hasfarim HaChitzonim, or in English, or in Greek, the Apocrypha. So there are books that are holy, but not holy enough to make it into the Bible, that are in a collection known as the Apocrypha. So that would be like the books of Maccabees, which describe the holiday of Hanukkah. Hanukkah, 165 BCE, about 100 years before the time of the rabbis, 60 years before the time of the rabbis. So it could have been in the Bible, but the rabbis did not include the 4 books of Maccabees, which talk about Hanukkah, but also talk about the dynasty of the Hasmoneans from the Maccabees and their descendants. The book of Judith, the book of Jubilees, and other books like that are in the Apocrypha, but do not make it into the Bible. So there's that concept of what is the Bible, and the Bible is what the rabbis say the Bible is. Okay, so for the rabbis' purposes, the book of Esther makes it into the Bible, and Ben Sira, which is a book more like Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, which is really a Jewish book. The rabbis, for some reason, decide not to include it in the Bible. So why is Esther in the Bible? So first of all, we should note, again, you can't say this enough, that God's name does not appear in the Bible, which leads me to the other idea. When we think of the Bible, we think as a text that is immutable, that it comes from God and it can't be changed in any way, and it is understood to be a divine work. Okay? The Book of Esther also challenges that idea. We have no problem seeing the Torah as a divine work, because the Torah itself describes that it came from God to Moses and the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. We don't have a problem with the books of the prophets being described as divine works, because the prophets proclaim themselves to be speaking in God's names. And the books of writings, like the Psalms, we have no problem with that being divine works, because they talk about the spiritual emotional response to moments in life. So, but the Book of Esther challenges that idea as well. What is divine about this? And if we say it's a history book, well, the events that are described in the Book of Esther challenge authenticity, challenge reality. So it starts with the very first verse, which says right here, it happened in the days of Achashverosh, that Achashverosh, who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Well, we know in the history of the world, there was no one empire that stretched from India to Ethiopia like that. Now, the Greek Empire made it almost to India, but not quite. They made it almost to Iran, I think, before Alexander was assassinated. And that was from Greece, North Africa, all the way across. I don't think the Greek Empire made it down to Ethiopia, and I don't think he made it all the way to India. You can challenge me on that, and you can look it up on Google right now. But the Persian Empire, if he's in Shushan as the capital, the Persian Empire never made it to Ethiopia. Okay? So this already challenges historical fact. Who is this Achashverosh? Oh, so the other thing, if the books of the Bible are divine and therefore are supposed to be understood as telling fact, then the traditional understanding is we have to accept the fact as is. So there are some Jewish scholars who try to prove that this Achashverosh actually existed. So we do know that there was a Persian emperor named Xerxes, and there was another one named Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes, Achashverosh, maybe are similar sounding names that you can say that Artaxerxes could have been Achashverosh. But then if you explore and get into the history of those emperors and who their queens were, there's no relationship to something happening with Vashti and then with this beauty pageant with Esther. Okay, so this challenges historical fact right here. There was never an empire like this for Persia that stretched from India to Ethiopia that had 127 provinces. And then also Achashverosh is described here basically as a fool and a drunk and a glutton. He loves to have big parties. He loves to have lengthy feasts. And so that also, really, what's the point of that? And also then, of course, we have a description of Haman, this evil vizier who plots just because of personal um, arrogance, wants everybody to bow down to him. And because Mordecai refuses to bow down to him, Haman devises this plan to kill all the Jews then in the entire Persian Empire because one Jew refused to bow down to him. He brings the plan to Ahasuerus, and Ahasuerus says, sure, go ahead, do it. And here's all the money, basically, to carry it out, however many talents of gold that is described here. So the amount of gold that Haman was paid to carry out this plot to kill all the Jews. And then what really gets to the point of begging reality is chapter 9. So when, right. And so on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, when the king's command and decree were to be executed, the very day on which the enemies of the Jews had expected to get them in their power, right? The Jews were supposed to be killed on that day. The opposite happened, and the Jews got their enemies in their power. Throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the Jews mustered in their cities to attack those who sought their hurt, and no one could withstand them, for the fear of them had fallen upon all the people. Indeed, all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's stewards, showed deference to the Jews because the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. For Mordecai was now powerful in the royal palace, and his fame was spreading throughout the provinces. So in the fortress Shushan, the Jews killed a total of 500. They killed the sons of Haman. Was reported that the king's 500 men, 10 sons. What then must they have done in the provinces of the realm? And Esther replied, let the Jews in Shushan be permitted to act tomorrow also as they did today, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on the stake. The king ordered that this should be done, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan. Haman's 10 sons were impaled, and the Jews were able to kill 300 more people in Shushan the next day. The rest of the Jews, those in the, likewise mustered and fought for their lives. They disposed of their enemies, killing 75,000 of their foes, but they did not lay hand on the spoils. What emperor in their right mind would let one group of people, as an act of revenge, kill the majority population of that empire? Okay, so because of these reasons, many people, non-Orthodox biblical scholars, say that the point of the Book of Esther is not to learn history, but rather to perhaps teach other lessons, mainly understanding that for most of our history, Jews have been living under oppressive regimes, have had their lives and livelihoods severely restricted, have been subject to persecution, to bigotry, to heavy taxation, you name it. We know that we have been victims for thousands of years, that perhaps the Book of Esther is here to provide a sense of relief, a sense of that 364 days a year, we live in despair and lack of a sense of pride in being Jewish, and a sense that we can walk about freely as Jews. 364 days a year, we feel terrible about being Jewish. I'm not saying here in America we feel that way. I'm saying before this time, for most of Jewish history, we were feeling this way. So perhaps one day a year, when we read the Book of Esther, we can escape that sense of despair and can imagine what it could be like to live in a time when Esther could be our heroine and Mordecai could be our hero, that we could be able to dupe the authorities and gain control and enact revenge on those who would do us harm. So I think that is, we'll talk more about this next week when we talk about the holiday of Purim itself. But for the Book of Esther, for this discussion about the Book of Esther, I think that this is most likely is the reason why there was no argument whatsoever from the rabbis as to why the book should be in the Bible. No question at all that it should be in the Bible. Because if you think about it, the rabbis themselves were living under horrendous persecution and oppression. The rabbis themselves were tortured to death by the Romans for daring to teach Torah publicly. And in fact, the martyrology service on Yom Kippur, traditionally, no matter what machzor you use, has descriptions of rabbis being tortured to death and assassinated by the Romans. So living in that time and living under those conditions, you can imagine that the rabbis would want a book like the Book of Esther to be in the Bible. And so a story that is mainly about revenge and is clearly fanciful in its details so that it's not historical, so it's purely fantastical, that it has a place in the Bible. I would argue, though, that in our day, when we live in a country that we are as grateful as we should be to live in a country like America, that with the Statue of Liberty as the icon representing what America stands for, the home for people seeking refuge, and where people of all stripes can find a home and make it, and where theoretically there is no bigotry, theoretically, we as Jews, at least as Jews, compared to how our ancestors experienced it, there's, in the scheme of things, anti-Semitism in America is way less than anti-Semitism in Europe, and acts of violence against Jews in America over the years, way less than anywhere else in the world. Not to say it hasn't happened in America, and obviously with Tree of Life Synagogue 2 years ago, clearly anti-Semitism is on the rise. But in the scheme of things in the history of Jews in America, reading the Book of Esther might seem odd. But if we're living in France or in Germany today, reading the Book of Esther might not seem odd at all. So, right, I'll get to these questions in a moment, Arnie. So there's that. There's also the sense of, so perhaps as Jews, as we journey through this Jewish year, as we study together, no matter what classes we study together, we know that being Jewish means to be a student of history, and that we can never forget our story, the story of the Jewish people, when we do Jewish things. So that it's when we light the Hanukkah candles, we think about the miracles of that time and the miracle today. We say that same bracha when we read the Megillah. We think about history when we say Kiddush on Friday night. We think about the creation of the world and the Exodus from Egypt. When we celebrate Passover, we relive the Exodus from Egypt. So reliving history is part of what it means to do Jewish things. So that it should be, it makes sense to read the Book of Esther in light of the history of the Jewish people. What I'm suggesting is that the reason why the Book of Esther is in the Bible, perhaps, is for this imagining this sense of revenge, that sense might be a problem for modern religious, spiritual people. That revenge does not seem to be a religious concept. In fact, it should be anti-religious concept. Like we're used to the Christian idea of turning the other cheek, right? So the Christian ideal is not to have revenge at all. The Jewish ideal is, well, you certainly are entitled to self-protection, but revenge should not be a religious idea today. And that when we read the Book of Esther, then, if it's in the Bible, then that means that the concepts that the book teaches are concepts that the rabbis want us to learn. And if revenge is there in the Book of Esther, which it clearly is, then revenge is a concept that the rabbis want us to learn. And my argument, as I'm suggesting, is that might be a problematic argument today. And I'm not the first, of course, to bring this up. Dependent upon the edition of the Book of Esther that you're reading, especially in synagogue, depending on the booklet that we have, some booklets actually gloss over that killing that takes place in Shushan, those verses from chapter 9. There are some editions of the Book of Esther that you read in synagogue that you won't find it there. It'll be there in the Hebrew, but it won't be there in English translation, because the translator or the editorial committee that made the translation decided best not to have it in English. Just keep it in the Hebrew, because most people don't understand the Hebrew the editorial committee is suggesting, but let's not have it in English because we don't want to promote this idea today. It's like what we find in our new Lev Shalem prayer book and Machzor, where some sections are written in smaller print to suggest that we don't have to say that section, and it's sections that deal with revenge against our enemy, asking God, like we do sometimes in the Amidah, to enact revenge against talebearers or those who are out to get us. That there are sections there in the prayer book where it's written in smaller print, so we don't have to, we might not want to say those sections. So it's a more modern idea today about perhaps not wanting to talk about vengeance. So Arnie suggests, yes. So the other idea, what about promoting this idea of Esther intermarrying, right? The whole idea of this beauty pageant, like who in their right mind would suggest that a nice Jewish girl named Hadassah, right? And that the major women's organization is named for her, right? Her Hebrew name is Hadassah. She takes a Persian name. So she changes her good Jewish name, Hadassah. Hadass is myrtle. It's one of the branches we use in a lulav and etrog when we shake the lulav and etrog on Sukkot, right? We have the palm branch, we have the etrog fruit, we have the willow branch and the myrtle branch. The myrtle is Hadass. Hadassah, same word, just feminine or masculine. So she has a good name, Hadassah. A lot of names in Hebrew are based on plants or birds or things like that, flowers. So she has the name Hadassah, but in order to enter this beauty pageant, she knows I'm not going to even get into the beauty pageant if I have a Hebrew name. Got to change it to a good Persian name, right? I'm not going to make it in Hollywood with whatever Kirk Douglas's original name was, which was some like very, very Yiddish name. You know what it is, or Jack Benny or George Burns or Don Rickles, whatever their original names were. You're not going to make it in Hollywood with those names. You got to Tony Curtis, you name them all. Whatever their original names were, they got to change it in order to make it big in Hollywood. So the same for Esther. Esther, Esther is the Persian goddess, Astarte, the fertility god. So so she changes Mordechai, her uncle, her ward, however you translate that, suggests change your name, this good Persian name. It's like Jane Doe. Change your name and enter this beauty pageant so that you can hopefully become the next queen of Persia, and it'll be good for the Jews, perhaps, if you do that. So that, yes. Right. So, as Arnie suggests, nobody would suggest doing that today in the Orthodox world. But of course, the rabbis, because they say the book has to be in the Bible, and therefore it is in the Bible, and because it's in the Bible, then you have to make it Jewish. Okay. So, how it becomes Jewish is the first, you have the connection, the historical connection that the rabbis make, that Haman is a descendant of the Amalekites. So the Amalekites were the first nation that attacked the Israelites after we crossed the sea, after leaving Egypt. And they attacked from behind, and where the weak and the ill were. And so because of that cowardly attack, we're supposed to annihilate the Amalekites. The Haftarah this coming Shabbat is Shabbat Zachor, in which King Saul was supposed to fulfill that commandment, and he leaves King Agag alive. Samuel has to finish the deed, and because he's King Agag, Haman is an Agagite, and therefore, according to the rabbis, Haman is a descendant of the Amalekites. And Mordechai obviously is a Jew, and from the tribe of Benjamin, and Esther, his cousin. So there's that connection that the rabbis make. And then also, because of the greater good that Esther was going to do to save the entire Jewish population of Persia, it was okay for her to marry Achashverosh. So yes, so that the rabbis, yes, with a lot of things in the Torah and in the Bible that could be problematic at first glance, the rabbis add midrash, their interpretation to it, in order for us to read it properly, that is through rabbinic eyes, in order to accept it and understand it the appropriate way. There are, I had Bible professors in rabbinical school who promoted this idea that essentially the Book of Esther is meant as a comedy, or meant to be this fantasy work to provide the sense of fantasy to the Jewish people in reading the book, what life could be like if only we were in power, that kind of thing. So I just wanted to share these thoughts with you today about the Book of Esther. And then next week, we'll talk about the laws that we learned, what of the 613 commandments are there to teach us from the Book of Esther about the holiday of Purim and how we celebrate the holiday of Purim. So we'll talk about that next week. So any any thoughts, comments, or questions about this book, about the Book of Esther? Jules, so get Judy to unmute you, because yeah, unless you know how to unmute yourself. Yeah, so.
There you go.
There you go. Go ahead, Jules.
I try hard to keep a timeline with where we're going with all this.
Yes.
And so I came to the point just before the last part of your talk where you talk about what the rabbis are trying to justify
Yes.
the book to be in the Bible.
Yes.
And that was the question that kept running in my mind. What connection did the book have to the Torah, to the 5 books of Moses, or to
well, so books of the Bible don't necessarily have to have a connection to the Torah. They do have to have a connection to Jewish concepts that the rabbis want to promote. So it's either to the Torah, to the land of Israel, to the temple in Jerusalem, to the kings of Israel, those kinds of things, or to the exile to Babylonia. So there are a few books of the Bible that take place in exile, right? So after the first temple was destroyed and the Jews were exiled to Babylonia, you have the book of Ezekiel. The prophet Ezekiel prophesies to the people in exile. The book of Daniel takes place in exile. And the book of Esther supposedly takes place in exile. And you have Ezra and Nehemiah take place in exile and going back to the land of Israel and encouraging the people to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And you have Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi, 3 of the prophets who are prophesying back in the land of Israel, encouraging the people to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem as well. So you have those ideas. The rabbis wanted the Book of Esther there, I think, because they thought I don't know if the rabbis thought that the book was historically accurate or not. I do think that the rabbis thought that in the time in which they were living, which was great oppression and persecution and murder of rabbis, that the book made sense for them to have it in the Bible as a source of hope and a source of what it could be like if we were in charge again. Barbara, unmute yourself. Yeah.
I was just going to say that that there was a need for it to be there because it was a way of giving of hope because of all the oppression, and it's something to hold on to.
Right. I absolutely believe that. And I think that, but it just goes with on the other hand, that again, the issue of what is the place of the emotion of vengeance in a religious mindset. And clearly in our prayer book, the rabbis have great stock in this emotion, and revenge is found throughout the prayer book. We are reminded of it every morning and evening, right before the Amidah, when we are reminded of God drowning the Egyptians in the sea and redeeming us as we hope for future redemption. We ask in the Amida 3 times a day to be saved by God from those who persecute us. So we have either asking God to save us from people who are out to get us, or even more so, asking God to enact revenge on people who are out to get us. So in the older Jewish traditional mindset, revenge is there. I'm suggesting that for moderns, I'm not so sure that revenge is an acceptable concept in religion. And that's reflected in our newer prayer book with the option of not saying these sections. And I'm not sure how I personally feel about it. I think that having this concept of revenge in our culture, in our religious culture, that is, only promotes negative feelings toward other people. In a time in which we want to promote positive, inclusive, warm feelings toward others, it might be a good idea to avoid those sections in which we are reminded of how people have acted badly against us. Because if we're reminded about people who have acted badly, we're going to maintain those bad ideas. And that perhaps it promotes a sense of, a sense that it's okay to view some people as bad people and some people as good people. I think that if we had a more positive feeling toward all, that we have, in other words, if the prayer book promoted only positive feelings, then I think that might argue and promote in general for us to have positive feelings. I don't know. I don't know if that, I could be too naive. I could be too idealistic about that. But I don't know. If you talk about revenge all the time, 3 times a day, then you're going to end up subconsciously thinking that it's okay to think this way about other people.
Rabbi, when you talk about the Bible, do we have a living Bible?
What does that mean?
Well, if we have a living, there's a big argument with whether we have a constitution that's living, that can be interpreted and broadened into American society, or whether there's a stringent view that you got to turn your mind back to the day it was written.
No. So as conservative Jews, we think that the Torah is a living document. Living in terms of how the rabbis interpret it, and the method of interpretation is ongoing, dynamic, and continually evolving. As conservative Jews, yes, the Torah, that is the legal aspects of the Bible, the Torah itself and other parts of the Bible are a living document. Yes, so it's not about getting back to what it was before and living back in that time. No, it's about continuing to evolve. Barbara, did you have your hand up again?
Yes. I was saying the Bible is written in what was right for at that time. And at that time, since people did not move around a whole lot, this is where they were. And you either, every area had its own section and their own rule. And so revenge, what was possible, it's only later when so many people are moving around and areas become integrated that you got to say, you know something, you have to learn to live with each other. And when you've learned to live with each other, you got to take revenge off the table.
It's possible. Yes, there are elements of that are there in all the books of the Bible that reflect relationship to outside culture, and perhaps some of the books that didn't make it into the Bible were too much influenced by outside culture. So one argument about the books of Maccabees, for example, is that first of all, they're written in Greek and not in Hebrew or in Aramaic, and that already books of the Bible, according to the rabbis, either had to be written originally in Hebrew or Aramaic. So if it's written in Greek, that's too much of a bad influence. And it's possible that there are too many Greek influences in the books that didn't make it into the Bible. So so the rabbis had to be the filter, and they gave themselves the authority to be that filter of which books promote Jewish ideas and which books would be too threatening to Jewish ideas and therefore would not be in the Bible. Okay, we'll stop here for today, and we'll continue the discussion next week about how we understand the holiday of Purim in light of the Book of Esther itself. So have a good rest of the day, everybody.
Yasher Jonah.
Same to you, and stay safe and healthy, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.
You.
Thanks, everybody.